The snow was falling in slow, deliberate flakes, thick enough to soften the sharp edges of the mountains but not heavy enough to silence the wind. It moved through the pines with a low, constant murmur, like the mountains were breathing. Clara stood just outside the cabin, her boots sinking into the powder, her shoulders tight beneath her worn coat. The cold had nothing to do with the way her hands trembled. She had chosen this moment carefully, or at least she thought she had. Evening was settling in, the sky turning the pale gray blue that always came before night in the high country. Eli had just finished stacking firewood, his movements steady and unhurried, as if time itself bent to his rhythm. He was built like the land around him, broad, solid, shaped by years of work and weather. To Clara, he seemed unbreakable, and that made what she needed to say feel even heavier. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, nearly swallowed by the wind. Eli paused, one log still in his hands, and turned to face her fully. He didn't rush her. He never did. He simply waited, his dark eyes focused on her as though nothing else in the world existed. Clara drew in a breath so deep it almost hurt. The air burned her lungs, sharp and clean, nothing like the stale rooms of her childhood. She had run far from those memories, across valleys and towns, until the road ended and the mountains began. She had thought distance would erase the past. Instead, it had followed her quietly, settling into her bones. "I'm a drunk's daughter," she said at last. The words hung between them, fragile and exposed. She forced herself to keep going before fear could choke her into silence. "My father drank from the time I was small. Some days he was loud and laughing, promising things he never kept. Other days he couldn't even look at me. The whole town knew. Every stumble he made, every bottle he emptied, it all became my name too." Eli set the log down gently, as if sudden movements might shatter her confession. He still didn't speak. His silence pressed on her, and old instincts flared, filled a quiet, "Defend yourself, explain why you're not worthless." "They looked at me like I'd end up the same," she continued, her voice stronger now that the dam had cracked. "Teachers, neighbors, boys who smiled until they learned whose daughter I was. I worked harder than everyone else, tried to be better, cleaner, quieter. But it never mattered. I was always just his." Her throat tightened. She stared at the snow at her feet, unable to look at Eli. This was the moment she had feared from the beginning. The moment he would see her differently, when the unspoken line between them would finally be drawn. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to lie," she said softly. "I didn't tell you because I wanted, just once, to be known for who I am now." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke from the cabin chimney. Clara waited for the familiar weight of judgment to settle on her shoulders. She braced herself for questions, for polite distance, for the careful retreat she had learned to recognize so well. Instead, Eli stepped closer. His boots crunched in the snow, and before she could flinch away, his hand found hers. It was warm, rough from years of labor, steady in a way that sent a quiet shock through her chest. She looked up, startled, meeting his gaze at last. "You think the mountains care where you came from?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as if he were talking about the weather or the trail conditions. He glanced briefly at the towering peaks around them, their silhouettes dark against the fading sky. "These mountains don't ask what your father did," he continued. "They don't ask who raised you or what name people gave you back there. They test how you stand when the wind cuts and the ground gives way. They test whether you keep moving." Clara felt something shift inside her, a tight knot loosening just enough to let her breathe. "I've watched you since the day you came here," Eli said. "You didn't complain when the work was hard. You didn't ask for pity. You learned fast, asked questions, listened. You face people straight on, even when you're scared. That tells me more about you than any story about a man who failed you." Her eyes burned, and she blinked rapidly, embarrassed by the sudden rush of tears. "Most people don't see it that way. Most people don't live up here," he replied simply. He tightened his grip on her hand, not possessive, just present. "You didn't choose your father. You chose to leave. You chose to survive. That's no small thing." The snow continued to fall, settling into Eli's beard and the folds of his coat. Clara realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale. With it went years of shame she had carried as if it were her duty. "I was afraid you'd look at me differently," she admitted. "I do," he said. Her heart sank for a split second before he finished. "I see you clearer." The words hit her harder than any rejection ever had. She laughed once, softly and unsteadily, the sound breaking free through her tears. Eli didn't pull away or rush her. He simply stayed, letting the moment unfold at its own pace. For the first time, the truth didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a door closing on a past that no longer had power over her. As the light faded and the cabin windows began to glow warmly behind them, Clara stood in the snow with a man who saw her not as a drunk's daughter, but as a woman who had found her footing in the mountains and was strong enough to stay. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the stone chimney as night settled fully over the mountains. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, testing the logs as if curious about the life sheltering within them. Inside, the warmth wrapped around Clara like a heavy blanket. The small room glowed amber, lit by flame and a single oil lamp on the rough wooden table. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and shrinking with every flicker of the fire. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her coat lay draped over a chair, slowly drying, and her boots rested near the door, dusted white with snow. Everything about the cabin felt solid and real, the thick logs, the iron stove, the simple furniture built to last. It was the opposite of the places she had grown up in, rooms filled with noise, broken promises, and the constant smell of alcohol. Here, the air smelled of wood smoke and pine, and the silence felt safe. Eli poured hot water into 2 tin cups, adding a pinch of dried herbs he'd gathered in the summer. He moved with quiet confidence, as if the cabin itself responded to him. When he handed her a cup, their fingers brushed, and Clara felt the same steady warmth she had felt outside in the snow. She stared into the steaming liquid, her reflection wavering on the surface. Her confession still echoed in her mind, raw and exposed. Part of her expected the moment to collapse under its own weight, for something to shift between them now that the truth was out. She had lived her whole life waiting for the other shoe to drop. Eli sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. He studied her for a long moment, not with curiosity or doubt, but with a kind of careful attention that made her chest tighten. "You've been carrying that alone a long time," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "It never really leaves you," she admitted. "Even when you run far enough that no one knows your name, you still hear the old ones in your head." "I know something about that," Eli replied. His voice was even, but there was depth beneath it, the weight of lived years. "People think living alone in the mountains means you're escaping something. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it means you're choosing what you'll live with instead." She looked up at him, surprised. He didn't talk about himself often, and when he did, it was usually about practical things, the weather, the land, the work. This felt different, quieter, and more personal. "I used to think love came with conditions," Clara said after a moment. "Be better. Be quieter. Don't make trouble. Don't remind anyone of what they want to forget." Eli shook his head slowly. "That's not love. That's fear wearing a familiar face." The fire popped, a log settling as embers shifted. Clara felt the words sink in, settling somewhere deep. She wrapped both hands around her cup, letting the heat seep into her palms. "I don't know how to be anything else sometimes," she confessed. "I don't know how to stop waiting for someone to decide I'm too much, or not enough." Eli leaned back slightly, considering her. Then he spoke, his voice low but certain, as if he were stating a fact carved in stone rather than an opinion. "Clara, you're my wife. That's all that matters." The words landed slowly, almost unreal. She stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "But we never," she stopped, unsure how to finish. They had never spoken of it plainly, never named what had been growing between shared workdays and long evenings by the fire. He held her gaze. "I know." 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind, doubt, hope, fear, longing. "You don't know everything about me," she whispered. "I know enough," Eli replied. "I know you don't quit when things get hard. I know you notice small things most people overlook. I know you carry other people's pain even when it costs you. And I know you've survived things that would have broken many. She swallowed, emotion tightening her chest. What if my past catches up to us? It already tried, he said. And it didn't win. He stood and crossed the small space between them, kneeling in front of her so they were eye level. His hands rested lightly on her knees, grounding her. Your father's choices don't belong to you. They never did. You don't owe the world an apology for surviving him. Tears spilled freely now, but Clara didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, each one carrying something old and heavy with it. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. The simple closeness made her breath hitch. I've never been chosen like this, she said softly. Eli pressed a gentle kiss to her hair. Then let this be the first time. They sat like that for a long while, the fire burning lower, the wind outside losing its bite. Eventually, Eli stood and added another log to the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. He offered his hand to Clara, and she took it without hesitation, letting him guide her to the bed. As she lay down, wrapped in thick blankets, she listened to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling, the soft crack of wood, the distant howl of wind against the mountains. Eli lay beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, his presence steady and unchanging. For the first time in her life, sleep came without fear. She wasn't bracing for raised voices or broken glass. She wasn't running or hiding or pretending. She was simply there, in a place where her past had no authority. Outside, the storm continued to move across the peaks, wild and untamed. Inside the cabin, Clara understood something simple and profound. She was no longer defined by where she came from. She was defined by where she stood now, beside a man who saw her fully and chose her without hesitation. And in that quiet certainty, she finally felt at home.